When you first assemble your flash and put the front wheel on the bike, you may find that you need to adjust your front brakes. They might be either too tight or too loose. So we'll talk through how to make that adjustment. Before we get into it, if you're a little bit concerned about it, you can just take your bike into a local bike shop. They can do this in 2 seconds. But if you're mechanically inclined and you want to learn how to do it, I'm going to walk you through it right now. Before we get into how to do it, I'm just going to talk through how these brakes work so you understand the process. With Flash's mechanical disc brakes, you have a metal rotor just like this one on your front wheel. And then on either side of that rotor, you have your 2 brake pads. Now, the right brake pad, represented by my thumb here, never actually moves. It's stuck in the same position all the time. And when you squeeze your left brake lever, the front brake lever, it actually moves only the left pad, this one here, and it squeezes the rotor in between the 2 pads. So you may find when you first put your bike together that even when you're not squeezing the brake, these 2 pads might be rubbing the rotor, in which case they need to be moved so that they're further away from the rotor. Now you also might find that when you squeeze your brake lever, it feels too soft and you're not getting a good grip on the brakes. That is because the brake pads are too far away from the rotor and we need to adjust them so that they're closer in. So we'll talk through now how to adjust those pads so they're the right distance. And when we do that, we always want to make sure that in the end, they're equally balanced and they're both about the same distance from the rotor. So let's talk about how to do that. So the first thing you want to do is stand over the bike and look down and see if you can sort of see the rotor going in between the brake pads. And sometimes you can tell there, you can see if there's some daylight in between them, in which case they're not touching the pads. But if one of the pads is touching the rotor, that means we need to move it further away. So let's assume that the left pad is pushing up against the rotor. The first thing we want to do is adjust the cable up here by your brake lever. This piece here turns just like a screw, and we're going to rotate the whole thing around. I'm turning it counterclockwise and you'll see the metal piece moves further away from the lever. And what I'm doing here is actually tightening the cable. So I'm going to move this all the way out. If you go too far, the whole thing will unscrew, so you don't want to go all that distance, but we'll go to about here. And what I've done is I've tightened the cable, and as I'm doing it, if you're looking down, you may be able to actually see the brake pad moving closer to the rotor. And when I squeeze my brake lever, it's pretty tight because there's not much space between the pad and the rotor. If that's too tight, I can move it away by rotating this around so it moves closer to the lever. So now I've got it all the way against the lever. That's as loose as the cable will go. And you can see now that this brake lever is pretty loose. A good rule of thumb is you don't want the brake lever so loose that when you squeeze it, it hits your hands like that. So that's too loose. We're going to tighten it up. So I spin that out. That feels pretty good. I'm looking down, I can see some daylight in between the pads and the rotor, so that's in a good position. The very last thing I do is take this inside piece and this is just a locking washer. You rotate that around until it's snug up against the lever, and that just keeps the entire piece from moving. So that's good. Now the cable is a good length. But let's say you still needed to adjust the pads even after going all the way in or all the way out with this cable. It's still not in the right position. In that case, we need to go down to the brake itself. To adjust the pad positioning down here at the brake, you need a 5mm Allen key, and you use it right in here in this bolt at the bottom. And all you need to do is just loosen that a little bit, and that will loosen this cable right here. Now if you need to get the pad closer toward the rotor, you pull this cable tighter and then tighten this bolt back up. If the pad is too close and you need to move it further away from the rotor, then you would push this cable through a little bit to loosen it and then tighten that bolt back up. And you probably need to do that a couple times, play with the lever, make sure it's in the right place. And remember, we always want to make sure that both pads are about equal distance from the rotor. So after you've adjusted the left pad, you may also need to adjust the right pad. To adjust the right pad on your mechanical disc brakes, you still need your 5mm Allen key, but in this case, we just stick it right here in this little hole, and you'll see the words there. It tells you that if you spin it clockwise, it says R pad in, and it actually clicks. So you just do it a couple times till it clicks into position, and that's moving the pad closer to the rotor. If I needed to move it further away, I just go counterclockwise, and just do that a couple times. You can pick up the wheel and spin it, make sure it's not rubbing. And again, always make sure that both pads are equidistant from the rotor, and you're good to go.